In this video, we are going to learn about forms in HTML. Forms are all over the web, and you'll see them everywhere from purchasing a product online to signing up for an email campaign to subscribing to a newsletter to entering a search term into Google. Everywhere that you can input text and either complete a transaction or receive some information back is what is called a form. So this is an example of a form, this is an example of a form, etc. So forms are incredibly important on the web, and they're incredibly important to know how to use. It's the way that people pay you money. It's the way that you are able to get engagement with potential subscribers or clientele. It's a way for people to contact you on your personal website. So let's kind of dig in a little bit and look at how we would create a form. So we're going to start with the HTML. We'll add a little bit of CSS later just to kind of make it look nice. But the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start with the form tag. So the form tag is a container similar to the main or the header or things like that, in that it does not really do anything by itself. It needs its child components, or child elements rather, to function. So you'll notice when I set up the autocomplete for the form, I get this action attribute with an empty value. So the meaning of that is that this could be either post or get. Now get would be a situation where we're trying to get information from a server. So we're requesting information. Maybe we're inputting a form to get back a list of subscribers or something like that. A post would be posting information to the server. It would be adding information such as your order or your subscription information. So we're not going to use that right now. We're just going to take that off. This is just for demonstration purposes. We're not going to have a functional form when this is done. But inside the form, we're going to have another element called field set. Now, field set is another container element, and what a field set will do is it will separate different parts of your form from each other. So sometimes there are parts of the form that are related to each other, but not necessarily to other sections of the form. This will make a little bit more sense when I set this both up. So we can have multiple field sets within a given form. Each field set is related to the form, but not necessarily related to each other. So inside my field set, I'm going to give this a legend. And the legend is going to be basically like what the title of the field set is. So this is the first field set. Actually, let's make this a little bit more realistic. Personal information. Okay, so now I have my field set. The browser default style is a border, and then an offset legend up top there. So now that I'm in my field set, I can start adding the elements of the form to collect information. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use the label tag. And you'll notice here that we have for attribute that comes along when we do the autocomplete. I'll come back to that in just a second. So here we'll say first name. And in here, I'm going to say first dash name in the for attribute. Now we're going to put an input element here. So we'll say input. And by default, your input type is a text input. That means that you're going to be able to put just text, really whatever you want in here. It doesn't discriminate what gets put into it. So now we have the input. I need a way to associate this input with this label. That's important for assistive technology when people use screen readers to access your forms, but it's also important for user experience, and I'll show you why when we get to a different kind of input type. So in here, in my input, side note, inputs are self-closing elements. You do not need a closing input tag. It's much like an image tag in that regard. So inside my input, I'm going to add another attribute of ID. Now we learned about IDs when we talked about basic CSS and how to set up styling selectors, but in this case the ID is what's going to tie this input directly to that first name label. So we'll say ID equals first dash name. So now that this input has an ID value that matches the for attribute of the label tag, these two are linked to each other. So let's set up a little bit more. Let's do a label for last name. And the for and the ID attributes can have whatever value you want as long as they match. So we'll say last name. We'll do another input. Type equals text. And then we'll say ID equals last name. Okay, so now we have two form inputs here. Let's add a little bit more. Next up, we'll say, let's do an input for age. So we'll say label for equals age. And we'll say age. And then we'll do another input here. But instead of doing type equals text, let's use a new type of input, and we'll say type equals number. Now you'll notice that this little up and down chevron has appeared in that. That's because this is a number type input, and I can only validly put numbers in here. If I were to put letters in here and try to submit this form, I would get an error. But it does give me the added value of having this additional form control where I could use up and down keyboard arrows to get those values in there. So we have input type equals number. We've got our for equals age attribute on the label, so let's add that matching ID. So we'll say ID equals age. And then let's put in another field set. So we'll come down here below this first field set, and we'll say field set. And we'll give this another legend, and we'll say contact information. So personal information, name, last name, age, are related to each other, so they are in this first field set. Contact information are related to each other, so it's going to be in this second field set. And all of this is going to be required for this form. So let's add some things in contact information. So let's say label for email, and we'll say email. And then we'll need an input in here, so we'll say input type equals email, and we need to make sure that we have that matching ID here, so we'll say ID equals email. So now nothing really looks different about this. At first glance, you're still just putting text in here, but if this is on a phone, because you have type equals email, you're going to get the keyboard comes up that has the @ symbol in the initial display, so it's a nice user experience bump by using the input type equals email. Let's do one for phone number, so we'll say label for phone number. Now you might think here that we would use an input type equals number. And that would make some sense because this is a number after all. But if somebody were to try to input their phone number with dashes, then you'd run into a situation when they tried to submit this, the form field would error because those dashes are not technically numbers. So in this case, for a phone number, it's okay to leave it as type equals text, and then we can add a different attribute called input mode equals tell. Now, there's a lot of different things with input modes. There's a lot of different values that you can give to it. Tell is really nice because if you are on a phone and you go to type into this phone number input field, the actual phone number keypad will come up, and that's pretty handy user experience. Okay, so now we've got personal information with a bunch of different labels, and then we've got contact information. And then let's make a final field set for just some extra stuff. And we'll have the legend say sign up for emails. So in here, we're going to add a label, and we'll say label. Actually, we'll just do the autocomplete so we get that for attribute. So we'll say sign up. Say sign up. And now we're going to use a new input called checkbox. So we'll say input type equals checkbox. And you'll notice the input that comes up is a clickable checkbox. So right now, I have to click on this little checkbox to get that to actuate. I can't click on the label and get that to actuate. I mentioned before that having a for attribute with a value that matches an ID attribute on the input improves user experience in addition to the necessity that it provides for assistive technology users. So let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to add an ID here that says ID equals sign up, associating this input with this label. And now I can click on the label and it checks the checkbox. And I can also do that here. So that makes for a better user experience because you have more clickable area. Okay, let's look at a couple other things. Next up, we're going to use a select menu. So let's give a label, and we'll say frequency for the for. So we'll make this say how often. And now I'm going to show you another form element called select. So we'll set up the select. And then inside the select, it's worth noting that the select is not self-closing. The select needs to wrap other elements, so it has to have a closing tag. In here, we need to have option tags. So we'll say option quarterly, option monthly, option select one. And then let's go ahead and put the ID on the select. So ID equals frequency. Again, tying that label that says how often to the select menu. So now you can see I can open that and I have this drop-down menu. Now in order for these to work, if you were to actually submit this form, each of these options would need a value. So we'd say value equals 1, value equals 2, and then you'd have some settings on your server that knew what to do with those values when this form was submitted. Okay. All right, so now that we have this form set up, how would we go about submitting it? Well, there's a whole lot of things that go into submitting forms. Basically, it's more of a concern for the back end. Someone on your server would have to facilitate that. So there's nothing that we're going to do in this class that is actually going to make an active form. However, in Web 2, we do have active forms through WordPress. So that's something that we'll approach in a subsequent semester. This is really just showing you how to set up the HTML for a form. So in order to get this to work, if we had the necessary infrastructure in place to process this form, inside the form, we can do one of two things. We could use a button, and then we could just give whatever text we want in here that says submit. And then for this to process the form, we could use type equals submit. So it's a type attribute with a value of submit. If you do not supply this, and you only have one button in your form, it will submit it anyway. However, if you have other buttons in your form, and you want some of them to like trigger a modal or do something else and not submit the form, those will need to have a type equals button attribute in order to not submit the form. So we'll say type equals submit, and then this will submit the form. Alternatively, we could have another input, and this would be type equals submit, and then we would need to give it a value of what we want it to say. And we'll say sign up. And then we get that text showing up in here. Oops. So either one of those will make it so this form works. Okay, so those are the basics of setting up a form, the basics of using field sets with labels and inputs, and select menus and checkboxes. So before we wrap up on this, let's go ahead and look at some other types of inputs that we have available to us. Actually, before I do that, in the basic CSS video, we talked about the concept of inline elements versus block elements. And you probably notice here that all of my labels and my inputs are in a line. Meanwhile, each field set is on its own line, and the reason for that is that labels and inputs are block level elements, and field sets are, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. The reason for that is labels and inputs are inline elements, so they display inline, and field sets are block level elements, as are forms. So if we don't like the way this looks, we can easily override this default behavior in CSS. So if we come into the CSS panel and we say label, display, block, it'll override the default value and put it on its own line. We could either add input display equals block as its own CSS rule, or we could combine these here just because it's the exact same thing. So if you have a comma-separated list of selectors, they'll all get the CSS that you apply to it. So now we have all of our form elements on the same line. So that's okay, but maybe I want this checkbox to be next to the sign up. So in that case, I could come down to the checkbox and I could give it a class. I could say class equals check. And then for that, and I'll give the label the same class because I want the same style to apply to both of them. So we'll use a class selector. We'll say period check. We'll say display inline. And then you'll notice that that section is now inline, whereas everything else is block. So just as a reminder, you can always override default styling. For instance, if you don't like the border around the field set, you can override that with CSS. You have lots of options. Okay, so now that we've covered the basics of forms, let's look at some of the other types of inputs that we have available to us. So let's say input type equals date, and then we get this date picker show up. We'll say input type equals file, and then we have a file browser. We could say input type equals color, and we have a color picker. So we can do input let's find out what other options we have available. I just forget them all. Okay. Oh yeah, input type equals password. So we'll say input type equals password. And when I type in the password field, you notice it obscures it. We have input type equals range. And then you'll see we'll get a little range slider show up. You can move back and forth. So there's a whole world of inputs out there, and it really just depends on what you need for your specific form. But the basics are wrap the whole form in a form, group related input types within a field set with a distinctive legend that labels what type of information is expected to be in that field set, associate labels with their corresponding input using the for attribute that will have the same value as the ID attribute, and then submit a form using either a button type equals submit or an input type equals submit, and then the value attribute will have the text display. The reason that keeps doing that is because this is not a real form. So that's the basics of forms. They'll come in handy throughout your web career.